Hi, in this follow-up video to the mover video, we're going to pick up in that exact same example project and add another movement mode in. So there were some comments and questions around how do you add another mode. So in this video, we're going to cover adding a grapple, sort of a Spider-Man swinging line trace. And we'll take it through starting from the basics and copying the classes that we need. We'll get it 90% of the way to the grapple, enough that you'll be able to set up your own movement modes. This is just a test and learning project. These capabilities are still experimental, so I expect that they're going to change a lot as we move from 5.4.1 through to 5.5. But for those wanting to explore Mover a bit more, we'll talk through the concepts in setting up a brand new movement in Mover. All right, so let's get started. So to start this, we're going to do some very quick basic setup stuff. Just get that out of the way right away so we can focus on our web slinging grapple. So I went ahead and in the Mover example, I copied the character movement basic map, renamed it basic map grapple. I copied the IMC and created a input mapping for the grapple. I copied the extended pawn and called it extended grapple, and I copied the extended anim blueprint and called it extended grapple. So basically you should know how to do all of those things. In this map, what I did is I sort of created this little test area over here. That's something we can grab onto and grapple. And I wanted to make sure that I could flip back and forth between characters. So obviously the grapple, that's pretty basic. The IMC, I simply added G to grapple in that list. I went to the, let's see, where did I go next? I went to the anim blueprint and basically said, okay, copy kind of everything from ziplining to grappling. So I copied this bowl to be is grapple. And then in the event graph, I duplicated the logic. So I changed this cast to my new grapple cast. I added the, I probably should have done that first. I added the variables inside the blueprint class, and then did the exact same thing here, just grabbing grapple, throwing it into my anim blueprint. If it fails cast, blanking it out. And then in the actual anim blueprint, I'm simply adding an or statement here that says play the zipline animation if I'm ziplining or grappling. Again, this is a rough prototype. None of these things are production ready, just a way to see that we are physically grapple lining. So did that there. In the extended, couple of things in here, the apply IMC. Obviously I had to change that to include our grapple as opposed to the extended. So I did that there. Copied the check zipline to be check grapple. So check zipline does this and basically sets the ziplining variable. So our check grapple does the exact same thing. In character movement, I added grappling as a character movement. As of right now, it's zipline mode, but we're going to change that in a few minutes. But right now, I just wanted to make sure that I could basically get this to compile and work. So the check grapple gets called. So check grapple gets called on this chain. So the on movement change, they're basically doing the double check, the zip line, and the grapple. So I added grapple in there. On produce, I ran into this, which we're going to fix in a moment. But basically here on produce input, they're making this struct, which is defined in their C++ code. So we're going to need to make that change in order to make this work. And I think that is it for this area. Oh, and then of course down here I added the variables. Why don't I see the variables? Faulting, ziplining, double tipping, cropping. So I just copied these two variables here into grapple, so I have a separate set of variables. So copying the various actors and simply following the zipline logic to duplicate and set those up should get you to a fairly decent starting point. I then made sure, so in the character, if you show inherited variables, you can scroll down to tint, and I just changed the tint on my torso and my arms from green to pink for, again, my grapple-based pawn, just so that I could use the trigger volume and make sure I was running the right logic. Of course, you have to go to your skeleton and make sure your anim blueprint is the right anim blueprint so that you're running the grapple version of the anim blueprint, and you've wired all that up. So the last thing to do in that is, instead of swapping in this volume to the extended pawn, we need to swap to the extended pawn with the grapple. And to do that, they've done that in the level blueprint, which I can never remember. Here it is, open level blueprint. And way down, you'll see all the trigger volumes that they have set up. And if you scroll down past all of these, you will get to the one that says pawn swap. And on pawn swap, we basically need to change this right here to be the grapple version. And if we do all of that right, we should be able to play in level. Again, this is our standard pawn. And when we move into the swapper, we should come out pink, which we do. The only problem is, because we haven't changed the inputs, I can't actually move. So it works that we're swapping. It works that we're in the right class. We have the right anim blueprint. And so from this point, we're going to go do some of the code to actually make the inputs function. From this point, we need to start making some changes in C++. So rather than make the changes in the editor experimental plugin, I copied the mover examples and mover test from the engine plugins experimental mover folders, and just used Windows Explorer and copied those over under plugins. So I now have copied those three here. I then did the right click, generate my project files, and then went down to this abilities input, which is where the structure is defined. And in that, I simply just changed the comment to make sure I knew I was using the right one. Added the wants to start grapple into the data structure. And then you need to serialize it here. And then for debugging purposes, they add it to the string. So I went ahead and did that as well. So by making those changes here, building that, checking your build, I can never find this file. I think it's under here. Yeah, in my build, I added mover and mover examples, and basically compile that again. And that lets us now have the wants to start grapple for this ability structure, which they have right here. And so this is now reading from our plugin folder as opposed to the engine folder. And that gives us the extra field. So we can now actually insert that pin into that. And the rest of this, I think, is pretty good. We don't need to change those. And so if I take a quick look at find all of these references. We just need to figure out, do we need to replicate that? So here we have the enhanced input for zipline. We'll probably have to do a similar start and stop for our grapple. So those are all there, and then this is the one we just copied. Yeah, so this should be the only thing we have to do is create the enhanced input bindings to toggle on and off the grapple. So we're going to just right click, type grapple, and you should get your start grapple enhanced input, and then just expand that and connect these two pins. And then you can collapse that if you want, add a comment around it. And then the only other thing in here so far is here on begin play. We need to make sure that we're adding the grapple input mapping context to the existing list, which it takes the array, which starts with your standard movement and then adds advanced to that standard movement. And then when you do that, you will get to the point where you can move into the trigger volume, and you'll look at my input mapping context to the left, and the new one that will show up after the breakpoint shows that it is the input mapping grapple. And if you look in the middle of the list, you see start grapple is mapped to the character G. Okay, for the next step, what we are going to do is duplicate all of the zip line code. So we took zipline interface mode and transition, made them grapple interface mode and transition. We duplicated the two CPP files to our grapple, and then basically went through the entire code base and did sort of search and replace for all of the code. So basically at this point, what we do is just go through the entire movement mode and make it exactly the same as zipline, but replacing with grapple everywhere. Compile it so that you get a successful compile, and then that will create our new movement mode called grapple. And then we can go into the editor and assign that back in the blueprint. All right, so now back in the animated Manny Pawn extended grapple blueprint. If you go to the character movement component, if you remember earlier, we created this grapple movement mode, but we left it as zipline. Now, because we've compiled the new code, we should be able to pick the grapple mode here, and our grapple FName and our grapple mode are now associated, and you'll see that we have our max speed, which is the variable from our mode right here. So here's our max speed, and basically at this moment going to function identical to a zip line, and the transition mode at grapple end, we're going to auto exit into falling. So just like ziplining, because we created this transition, the grapple end transition is to auto exit into falling, which comes from the transition mode. Let's go to grapple transition. So we do a grapple start, which is a base movement mode transition, and a grapple end, which is a base movement mode transition. And here you see the auto exit mode defaulting to follow, which is exactly what you see here. Auto exit mode is falling on grapple end transition. So at this point, we would have to replicate this zip line here, where we have the interface being used by this actor, but we're not going to actually do that. But the way we currently are set up, we would have to go to the class settings, inherit an interface. So implement an interface, and we would add the grapple point interface. Oh, I guess we're going to need to rename those two functions, but we're not actually going to do that. So this would be if I wanted this zip line to be both a grapple point and a zip line. It's a good thing to probably name these functions uniquely so that we don't end up with this scenario further. So we'll go ahead and do that. But basically, now we're going to start to deviate away from the standard code and do some grapple specific code. So after copying the zip lines to the grapple versions and starting with the interface, I've changed the interface to be implemented on the pawn that the mover component is attached to, as opposed to in the zipline example, it is an actor that's placed into the world that has a start and an end. So in this case, what I really want to do is I want to do a line trace from my pawn, and then upon hitting something, I want to store that target location and then pass it back through this interface. So I changed the interface to be the grapple target location. The transitions, these are important, and I'll show you where in the blueprint they need to be set up. So you have a start transition and an end transition. They actually are quite simple in their design in that they are base movement mode transitions, and they have functions to evaluate and on trigger. And on evaluate, if you set them up, they're going to constantly be ticking the on evaluate. And then in the transition, so if we look at on evaluate, for the start of my grapple, when on evaluate is run, and again, this is run sort of every frame or every cycle, we basically are getting everything. We're making sure we have a valid mover component. We're checking that our current movement mode is not already grapple. And if we're not grapple, then we're going to get the ability input, which was those, which is these that we put in earlier. So we want to start grapple. You'll see that in the blueprint. So we get that bull flag. If it is true, then we're going to say, hey, okay, switch to grapple mode. And then we return that evaluation result. So this start transition on evaluate is cycling, looking for these conditions. When they're true, it will change to the grapple mode. The same is true for the end. So the end has an on evaluate. And the way I'm going to exit the grapple is I'm just going to jump. So if you think about it, you're going to grapple to a point, then I'll press the jump key, and then we're going to exit our grapple mode. We can, as indicated here, once you exit grapple mode, you can trigger some logic and do something specific at the end of that, but the transitions are important. Then in the way the zipline worked and the way the grapple that I've done is mimicking is there are two functions that are being overridden. One is the generate move, and the other one is simulation tick. Basically, we're using the simulation tick following the logic of the zipline. And let's go to what those look like. So here you see on generate move, there's really nothing happening there. Everything is happening here in the simulation tick. And this is where we basically have a bunch of variables. We determine if we are starting a brand new grapple state. If we are, I go ahead and grab the start location, the target location. This is via the interface. So I ask to execute the interface on the mover's actor. And then I determine I have a valid grapple location if the value I get from that is not 0. So that's just my way of determining whether I have a valid location. I set the direction be between the target location and the start location. And then this just sort of moves the character a little bit towards the starting location. You can add a little jump up or something to get started. And then as long as I came out of the start with a valid target location, then we're basically going to push the character into sort of an in the air or not valid. If we have a not valid, if we were unable to find a valid, then we're basically going to put them in falling state and just exit out of that. However, if we did find a valid target, then we're going to go ahead and continue the processing. We'll determine what's our desired end position, how fast are we going to move, will we actually get to there before, will we reach the end position on this tick, and then we just basically do the move. You can follow all that. It's very similar. It's actually almost identical to the zipline logic, and so that's the actual move. So the move mode, which is a base movement, overriding those two functions. I actually don't need this one anymore. I moved that into the class. And then we have this grapple state, which is the data. So for me, what I felt, the three pieces of data that I wanted to keep inside of each tick of the grapple move is where did I start, what's my destination, and the bull flag of whether or not it was valid. This allows me to basically lerp the character from start to target in a more smooth fashion. And the rest of this is all direct copies of how the zipline did it. So those are the C++ changes. Back in the pawn with the character motion component or mover, the movement modes here and the transitions here. So if you want to run a start transition, you need to add it to this list of transitions. And they're basically always, anything in this list is going to be evaluated in sequence of the list until one is successful. So if you put, as I have, if you put zip lining above grapple, then in a position where both might become true, the default will be the first one. And these transitions are occurring, these start transitions are being tested sort of continuously. However, inside the movement mode, there is also transitions. These transitions are only evaluated, same thing, they're done in sequence, but they're only going to be evaluated while in the grappling mode. So, in other words, there's no point in running exit criteria checks if you're not in the mode. So these transactions, the end transactions, are typically inside the mode since you're leaving. And the starts are typically here. However, every movement mode is going to be different. So basically those transition modes are triggered and are being evaluated here and here. And so they're constantly firing the C++ code. For the grapple logic, we added the one interface, and that one interface basically is just taking this local variable and passing it back. So whatever the value of this grapple target location variable is, it's going to pass it back. In my case, I have just a few variables defined here: the grapple target location, the max grapple distance, and then this, which is triggered, which is evaluated in the code. So this B wants to start grapple is what, let's see, on the onProduce input, if this thing is true, it will pass into this ability inputs, and this one right here wants to start grapple is what the transition is right here. So the ability inputs wants to start grapple is the one inside of this struct, which we're setting whenever we set this to true. And then once this happens, most of them are being set off to false again, so that it only triggers one time. If we look at our input action for start grapple, so this input action is set to hold and release as the mechanism. Oops. And therefore it will fire the started when you press the G key. And I just make sure I turn the grapple off in case it was on. It will tick while you hold the key down. And then when you release the key, that's when I trigger the change in movement mode. So in this function, I haven't quite finished this yet. You'll see when we test it. I'm not getting exactly the results I want, but basically I'm doing a line trace from the start of the actor to the max grapple distance. If I hit something, I'm going to update that location. And so the way that looks right now is, let's go to the event graph. Stick this over here. All right, so when we hit play, and we can't do that until we switch pawns. So let's switch to our advanced pawn. Okay, now let's. All right, so right now nothing is happening. If I hold the G key down, you see that it is processing that line trace until such a time as I let it go, and then it processes the release. So hold the G key, let it go. So that's updating the code in the that's updating the value, but the value is not being passed. The value is just being updated locally. And then in process, in here, what's happening is I just added this print string here to make sure that that is being passed through. So again, if I hold G and I let go, you'll see the true path light up and the print string is occurring. So I'm passing that data to my C++ code. And then am I in debug mode? I'm not in debug mode. The next thing is I check here to make sure this happens. So hopefully that helped in setting up a new mode. I've still got work to do to get the grapple functioning the way I want it to, but those are the basics of adding a new mode. Again, using the zip line as a foundation and doing some copy.